Friends, welcome to this on lecture series on ancient and medieval political thought. Friends, the last lecture was about Greek political thought and its background. This lecture, we are about to talk the contributions of Greeks in the realm of political thought or Western political thought. The Greek contributions to Western political thought. So we confine our lecture to just about the contributions of ancient Greek world to the Western political thought. So friends, I will be referring J.S. McLean's book titled The History of Political Thought for this lecture. That is my reference, major reference, The History of Political Thought by J.S. McLean. And I am referring the chapter 1, Origins, the Polis, Traditional Values, the Sophist. That is the title of the chapter 1, Origins. And friends, the history of political thought certainly begins with the ancient Greeks. Or political philosophy originates with the ancient Greeks. And we know that it is also assumed that political philosophy begins when people think critically about laws and institutions under which we live. So we can assume that throughout the history of the world, people reflected on their organized collective lives. And certainly, Greeks were not the first society to think and propose political philosophy in absolute terms. But friends, we can assume that Greeks were the first group of people in the world to leave behind a written record of their political philosophy for the first time in the history of human world. It was the Greeks who had left behind a written record of what they have thought about political institutions. In that respect, we can argue that Greeks were the first social groups who proposed an organized and systematic way of political philosophy. And friends, barring the written record, of course, certainly in different parts of the world, ancient people might have organized political philosophy. But the problem was that we don't have any written records. For example, in India, in China, you can find people reflecting about laws and political institutions under which they live. But what is the problem? The problem is that there is no written records of their political thinking. Friends, it is in that respect that Greeks are the first human groups who produced written evidences for their political thinking. And this practice began by 6th and 5th century BC. And by 6th century BC, the Greek people started asking questions about the nature and origins of the universe. The nature and origins of the universe. And in the last lecture, I have told you about the Thales of Miletus, and who was said to be the first political philosopher, or the first philosopher in recognition of the famous hypothesis he proposed. What was his hypothesis? He proposed that everything is water. Everything in this world is made of water. And he was credited with making this hypothesis. For that, he is said to be the first philosopher in the history of Western philosophy. And friends, in the 5th century BC, after successfully defending the invasion of Persian Empire, that the Greek people started to think about the origin of social world. So before that, I have told you that in the previous lecture that Greeks were basically natural philosophers, that they looked at the sky, looked at the stars, looked at the moon, looked at the sun, and started thinking why they are seen what it is. However, it is believed that after defending the Persian invasion, and Persia was a very powerful empire those days in 5th century BC, Persia was a powerful empire which started invading Greeks. And after defending the Persian Empire, Greeks also started to think about the origin of social world. And friends, Greeks were credited for proposing a famous concept in the history of Western political philosophy, which you already know, the idea of polis. And Greeks proposed the idea of polis in their social world. Like Greeks had proposed theories about physics, astronomy, geometry, chemistry, biology, botany. So they also started thinking about social world. And their first theory about social world was about polis. So just like as I told you, they began to propose theories in chemistry, physics, botany, biology, astronomy, mathematics. Just like that, Greeks also started proposing scientific theories about society. And their first theory about society was the theory of polis. And friends, in terms of social and political life, the ancient Greek people lived in a manner quite distinct from the life of or the lives of their immediate neighbors, say the Mesopotamians or the Egyptians, the Near East. I told you in the previous lecture, there were civilizations in the Neolithic era, particularly the Egyptian civilization and the Mesopotamian civilization. However, we know that the Near East, where you had the Persian Empire, you had the Egyptian Empire, which were ruled by very powerful emperors, very powerful kings, and their empire was benefiting only a small number of people. Not all the people in their empire benefited rules, benefited political organization. But unlike them, unlike the Persians and the Egyptians, friends, the Greeks had political organization which was centered around polis. And what was polis? Polis was a small self-contained institutional form which provided some sort of a communal life. There were no communal life in the Egyptian Empire or the Mesopotamian or the Persian Empire. But when it comes to Greeks of the 6th century and 5th century BC, friends, you will find that there were some sort of a communal life. And the Greek word for that communal life was polis. The Greek word for that communal life was polis. P-O-L-I-S, polis. And the English translation of the Greek word polis is of disagreements, because some writers say it can be translated into city, other writers say it can be translated into politics, while yet other group of writers argue that it is state. But an agreeable translation of the Greek word polis is city-state. So friends, the central to the life of polis is smallness in scale. Smallness in scale. What is that? So the territory of Greece was naturally divided into numerous self-contained areas. And many of such areas were centered around Aegean Sea, centered around Aegean Sea, and many of such areas were small areas were islands centered around Aegean Sea, where you can see geographically small areas like Athens, Sparta, Corinth. And in these small areas, there arose independent political societies by 6th century BC. Independent political societies. And friends, some of which had only few thousand citizens. Few thousand citizens inhabited such small areas. They call it as polis. And they had a few square miles of territory. Few square miles of territory. And according to Plato, in his book Laws, 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 in his final book Laws, ideal number of families for a good polis is 5040. 5040. That was the ideal number proposed by Plato. That should be the number of families that should inhabit a polis. When it comes to Aristotle, who in his book Politics, volume 8 says that an ideal polis must not be so large. It must not be so large, and it must not be small. So small. But anyway, friends, historians argue that by drawing on archival resources and interpretations of existing historical documents, historians argued that at the peak of its glory, Athens had a maximum of 40,000 citizens. A maximum of 40,000 citizens. I mean, 40,000 citizens means 40,000 citizens who will have the right to vote. There will be some 1 lakh women and 1,50,000 slaves. But they are not counted as citizens. Women and slaves reside inside the home. They will not come outside the home. So an ideal polity in 5th century or 6th century BC, for example, Athens, I told you, referring to historians' documents, at its peak of glory, Athens had a maximum of 40,000 citizens. And there were many Greek cities. There were many Greek cities in 6th and 5th century BC. In his writing, Politics, Aristotle had identified 158 different constitutions. 158 different constitutions. That means they were all different city-states, polises, having different constitutional types. And the historian Herodotus noted that though there were so many polises, all Greek people were bound together by a common language. a common way of life, and a common religion. The small size of the polis allowed its citizens to participate in a communal way of life, as explained by Aristotle himself. Central to the polis is the idea of a communal life. And communal life is based on a shared and mutual advantages. Is based on sharing as well as mutual advantage. Why do you live in a communal way of life? Because it is mutually advantageous. And Aristotle himself explained that. Aristotle calls, for example, that is useful also. A small country or small city state is very useful according to Aristotle. For example, Aristotle in his book Politics refers to a situation in Babylon. A situation in Babylon that is that was located in then Egypt. Babylon was a nation rather than a polis, because polis is small. Babylon was a very big nation. And Aristotle narrates a situation. When Babylon was captured by the Greeks, that story took almost 3 days to reach all the people who were living in different parts of the Babylon, because Babylon was a very big nation. And when the Greek people captured that city, it took almost 3 days to reach that news, to spread among all the people in Babylon. So therefore, small size of polis provided a good interaction between citizens. Small size of polis provided a platform for good interaction between citizens. And Greeks practiced a direct, participatory kind of democracy. Direct, participatory kind of democracy. The major institutions of many of these city states were popular assembly. Popular assembly. They otherwise call it agora, I think. Agora, A-G-O-R-A, agora. That was popular assembly. In the popular assembly, all male citizens above a certain age were able to participate. And their participation was also paid. If you want to participate, you have to pay. And communal life in the polis was not only confined only to political affairs. Right. So Greeks recognized the fact that there is no separation between religious life and political life. And today in our world, religion is a private affair. Politics is a public affair. There is no connection between politics, which is a public affair, a religion, which is a private affair. No state will interfere in the matters of your right to practice a religion or not to practice a religion. But friends, in ancient polis, Greek polis, There is not much difference between religious life and political life. Why? Because state itself propagated a state religion. In ancient Greece, state itself propagated an official state religion. An individual who was living in a polis was expected to fulfill certain religious obligations. And a citizen was expected to worship the official god of the state. And friends, that was one of the reasons why Socrates was subjected to trial, because he didn't worship the official god of Athens. He didn't worship the official god of Athens. And in the same way, Greek artistic works, including temples, sculptures, were all created for public religious observance. That means when you engage in public religious observance, that also means you are engaging in political affairs. Point is clear. That there is no difference between religious affair of a citizen and public affair of a citizen. And in the writings of many plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes, you will see that religious observance was very important when they created characters. Particularly, you might remember, I have told you many times, Antigone, who refused to obey the command of the king of Thebes. So the point is that Greek philosophers, particularly Aristotle, believed that man by nature is a political animal. And most Greek political philosophers upheld that idea, that human beings are by nature political animal. That like motor, by default, human beings will live in polis, or we are by birth programmed to enter into an organized political society. Human beings cannot make a life in isolation from other human beings. And for an Athenian man, democratic citizenship was the center of life. Friends, today all of us dare to speak against our state, dare to speak against our voting process, dare to speak against our politicians, political parties, parliaments, everything. And some people often say that I don't like politics and I don't like to vote. But friends, these days you can. But in ancient Greece, you can't say that, because getting citizenship fulfills your life. Voting was viewed as an aristocratic function. It was an aristocratic function, voting. So there was an ideal of widespread popular participation in ancient Greece. And Aristotle famously said, citizens were able to rule and to be ruled in turn. You are able to rule and you are also subjected to be ruled by someone else. But friends, keep in mind, we heard that Athens was democracy and Greeks were the first social groups in the world to practice some kind of democracy in the world. But friends, not all Greek city-states were democracies. There were also monarchies, tyrannies, aristocracies, oligarchies, different forms of government. And Peloponnesian War was basically a great struggle between Athens and Sparta that took place between 431 and 404 BC. 431 and 404 BC. That was historians depict it as a conflict between democracy, which was represented by Athens, and oligarchies, which was represented by Sparta. And three greatest Greek writers of all time, Plato, Aristotle, and Thucydides. Friends, these three greatest Greek writers were all against the idea of democracy. They never believed in the virtues of democracy. And in fact, Plato, in his book Republic, repudiated the very idea of democracy, and he preferred rule by philosopher king. So that means Greeks, along with the idea of polis, also contributed to the literature on democracy as well as on non-democratic political organizations. So they contributed literature on that area. For example, Sparta, which had a complicated mixed constitution, which had a very complicated constitutional type, in which in Sparta's constitutional type, power was divided among different offices. Power was divided among different offices and to different social groups of citizens. And Sparta was one of the ancient classic example of state power intruding into private life. A classic example of state power intruding into our private life. Today, we come across words like, surveillance, Big Brother, that state is secretly watching its citizen. These are present-day nomenclatures, surveillance. And one of the best classic example of a surveillance state is Sparta. And Plutarch, in his depiction of the life of Lycurgus, Plutarch talks of a legendary lawgiver in Sparta, where the lawgiver, that is the state, dominated all aspects of the life of citizen, just like you can imagine about North Korea today. In North Korea, somebody in your class had already delivered a seminar lecture on North Korea and life there, where we had come across that students speaking about state interfering brutally into the private life of citizen. And friends, Plutarch gives us record of state power and state power intruding into the private life of citizens. That state dominated in economic, religious, social, and including family life. Each Spartan family possessed a parcel of land that was given by the state. Citizens were denied economic activity. No citizen can have right to economic activity. Foreigners were banned from entering into the city, Spartan city. Possession of gold and silver was outlawed. Art was banned. All artistic expressions were banned, just like North Korea or some Islamic countries, where artistic expressions are banned. Like, the present day Afghanistan, Taliban, second Taliban, where almost all types of artistic expressions are banned. And above all, children are taken from families in their early childhood. And Spartans were raised by the Spartan state. And they were schooled by the Spartan state to be inducted into Spartan army. So in Athens, on the other hand, women were technically citizens. Women were technically citizens which were denied in Sparta. But in technically Athens, where women were technically citizens, they had few legal rights, but women lived in virtual seclusion. They rarely leave their homes. They were not allowed to see other men other than their close relatives and husband or father. Greek women generally lived under the authority of men. First, like the Hindu lawgiver Manu says, first under the control of their father, then their husband, and after that under their sons. The main function of a Greek woman was producing legitimate offspring. That was the only function of women in ancient Greece. And these offspring inherit right to property. Women were not even the primary object of male sexual desire. Women had only one function, producing legitimate offspring. And their men even had relationship with the prostitutes. For example, the orator Demosthenes famously said in one of his speeches that mistresses we keep for the sake of pleasure, concubines for the daily care of our persons, but wives to bear us legitimate children and to be faithful guardians of our households. That's said by Demosthenes in one of his speeches titled Against Neaera. Against Neaera. That was one of the speeches that he delivered. And even Pericles, about whom Thucydides has written voluminously, And Pericles, in one of his addresses, funeral speeches, famously said, the greatest glory of a woman is to be the least talked about by men. Right? മലയാളം വേണോ? ഒരു സ്ത്രീയുടെ ഏറ്റവും വലിയ ഗുണമെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ മറ്റു പുരുഷന്മാർ സംസാരിക്കാതിരിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. So the greatest glory of a woman is to be least talked about by men. That was the greatest virtue of a woman according to Pericles, about whom Thucydides has written in his book. So friends, this was some of the conceptual contributions of ancient Greek society, like polis, idea of women's position in society, direct democracy, communal life, city-state, role of slaves and children, as well as different forms of constitutions or different forms of government, virtues of citizen, virtues of polis. These were some of the conceptual contributions of the ancient Greek society to the literatures in political philosophy. And among this, one point is very important, which J.S. Macklanch talks about in his book, The History of Political Thought. That is, Greek notions of traditional values. That Greek people upheld moral principles, which they believe comes from traditional values. But there is dispute over what exactly is this traditional value according to Greek people among historians and among commentators on Greek life. But we can see that there was the existence of valid moral claims in ancient Greece, valid moral claims. And these valid moral claims were expressed in laws of the state. These valid moral claims were expressed in the laws of the state. It is difficult to say how widely traditional values were accepted in ancient Greece. It is very difficult to say. You can go to Thucydides' book or Herodotus' book or Homer's book, or you can go to ancient plays written by writers like, what was the name of that? Sophocles. Writers like, Sophocles, Homer, Thucydides, Herodotus. You can find some kind of explanations about traditional values in ancient Greek society. But writers disagree on the contours or the premises of the traditional value notions. Hesiod, H-E-S-I-O-D, Hesiod, a famous Greek poet of the 8th century BC, after Homer. Homer was considered to be the greatest of Greek writer. After Homer, Hesiod was considered to be a great Greek writer. In his works and days, Hesiod reflects about cosmic justice. This is something like we had studied something about natural justice, that in European Western political philosophy or contractual tradition, contractualists believe that even before a society was created, even before a political order was created, men in the nature enjoyed certain rights. Men in the nature had certain values. Such values they call natural rights. So this is something like that, that by nature, there is something called traditional values, that all people should respect that. This is what Greeks call traditional values. But what exactly is the nature of the traditional value differs from writer to writer. For example, Hesiod, in his writing, in his book Works and Days, reflects on cosmic justice. And cosmic justice was some kind of a traditional value. Or Sophocles, in his Antigone, talks about unwritten standards of right. Unwritten standards of right. Unwritten standards of right. For example, the king of Thebes ordered that the brother of Antigone should be left unburied, and his body should be eaten by vultures, because he had committed crime against the state. So his body should not be buried. And that is a decree from the king. And when a king orders something, that is considered to be religious also. But Antigone refuted that. And she says, of course, as a citizen of Thebes, I had the moral obligation to obey the decree of the king of Thebes. But as a sister, I had the obligation to obey something greater than the law of my land. That is, it is a right of the dead person to be buried. That is in the eyes of the God. That is the wisdom of the God. God wishes that a dead person must be buried. For that, she even refuted the order of the king of Thebes. That means Sophocles even talks about unwritten standards of right. That is also a traditional value. Something like later writers in the 16th and 17th century talks about natural rights of man. Clear? Or even Thucydides talks about traditional values or certain standards in public life. That there are some unwritten laws in ancient Greece which people consider greater than the laws of the state. Then in his funeral speeches, Pericles ascribed to the Athenians obedience to law. Obedience to law is a great virtue, both human law and divine law. Both human law and divine law. That means Pericles is indirectly saying that there are laws which are not created by humans. That means Greek people respected that there were some laws in the nature. But you should not confuse it with the contractual theories of natural laws. That is something different. So Greeks had some notions of traditional values, which has been even upheld by the philosopher Heraclitus, or in Plato's dialogue on Protagoras. Plato also talks about certain traditional values, unwritten laws. That was also a contribution of the Greek people to the literature in political philosophy, that there are some notions of laws which are, not man-made laws. And friends, finally, when you talk about Greek contributions to literatures in political philosophy, we have to consider an important and very important contribution in terms of ethical relativism. That, friends, we know that By 6th century BC, tales of Miletus had spoke of something. Ever since, different schools of thought emerged. And Greek had believed that they had great virtue. They are, philosophers of moral science. They had understanding about nature, and they are people with great wisdom vis-a-vis other societies. So they had a sense of pride in their culture. The Greeks had a sense of pride in their culture. But friends, in his book Histories, Herodotus talks about the contact between Greeks and non-Greeks. That the Persian Wars, that Darius I, Cyrus, who traveled a long way from Persian Empire, that present-day Iran, from the present-day Iran through the Asia Minor, they went to Greece and to conquer these city-states. And in this, difficult situation, Greek city-states united in their defense against Persian invasion. And in this situation, friends, Greek people for the first time came in contact with people in other part of the world. And there were, of course, contact with other people gave an idea to the Greek people that there are people who live in other areas of the world where they had knowledge, they had science of a primitive kind, they had moral, senses or traditional values. So therefore, the Greeks and their contact with the other societies, and they call other people from other societies as barbarians. In Western philosophy, the word barbarians are referred to people who are non-Greeks. And Greeks call the Persians as barbarians. And when they come in conflict with other societies, Society X believe that they are different from Society Y. And Society X believe that we are the best and they are the best. And an encounter emerged. And this encounter for the first time emerged in the writings of Herodotus, that the Persian Emperor Darius, who initiated contact between some Greeks and also some members of the tribe from Kalashia. Kalashia was from India, an Indian tribe. So Greeks came to touch with other people, came to be in touch with other people. So an ethical relativism, that there are some other people, we need to tolerate them, we need to respect their identity, that came to originate in Greek worldview with the Persian War. That is called ethical relativism. Ethical relativism. And ethical relativism, Greek ethical relativism had two dimensions: factual relativism and moral relativism. Factual relativism and moral relativism. And Greeks had contributed enormously to factual relativism and moral relativism, put together ethical relativism. That we are best, okay, but at the same time, there are other people who also have some kind of notions about the things around them. We also need to respect that. It's called ethical relativism. So this was also a contribution of Greek people to the literature in political philosophy. Friends, with this, I am going to wind up this lecture on the contribution of ancient Greeks to the literatures in political philosophy. And tomorrow we will talk about sophism. After that, we will go to Socrates. So friends, the floor is open for discussion. You can have questions now.